Hi, welcome. My name is Anastasia Kyrmanidou. I'm a Senior Sustainability Analyst with KERAMIDA, and I am specially qualified with ESG reporting standards and frameworks like TCFD, GRI, SASB, CDP, the whole alphabet soup. So I will be talking about climate-related risks and opportunities. And the focus of the talk is risks and opportunities. However, we will be touching upon climate scenario analysis very little, because we want to emphasize, of course, in the talk, the risks and the opportunities, but we also want to talk about how climate-related risks and opportunities and their identification can be a foundation, a basis for companies to start developing their climate scenario analysis or transition planning or action planning, you name it. So it's a basis. Risks and opportunities are a basis for doing that, for doing a climate scenario analysis. So without further ado, I'm going to go to my next slide. So in the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about climate-related risks and opportunities, what they are, how we define them in the sustainability arena, and why reporting of them is important, why reporting on them matters. I will be discussing where and how organizations can report on their climate-related risks and opportunities. Then I will be talking about the process of how to do that, how to start thinking about more comprehensively about your climate-related risks and opportunities. And then we're going to close this presentation by, some final thoughts about moving forward, looking ahead. Why do we do that? Why do we want organizations and companies and corporations and businesses to start thinking about their climate-related risks and opportunities in general? So the science of climate change is certain. And according to the IPCC, and IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it is the world's most authoritative body on climate science. So according to their sixth assessment report, climate change is already affecting every region of the world, with a different way, of course, but there is clear evidence that every region of the world is being affected, and we see evidence of changes in extreme weather events such as heat waves, such as hurricanes, droughts, tropical cyclones, etc. So the images that you see on the screen, they are from the IPCC report, the sixth assessment report, and they show the outcomes of scientific simulations on future warming, and they demonstrate what a 1.5, a 2 degrees, and a 4 degrees Celsius warming could look like. So unless emission reduction measures and strategies are taken rapidly, the world is going to exceed a 2 degrees Celsius warming. I'm going to open a parenthesis here just to say that currently we have exceeded a 1 degree Celsius warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And if we take a business as usual approach and we continue emitting with the same speed as we do now, this is called the business as usual approach, then it is projected that the temperature rise could be between 2.4 and 6.4 degrees Celsius. And that could truly have catastrophic impacts on our global economy and our civilization in general. All economies will be impacted. So the impacts of climate change will have effects on whole economies. And I have some findings from some studies here that we can briefly look at. The first one comes from the 2015 Nature paper, and this study found that unmitigated climate change is likely to reduce per capita earnings by 23% by the close of the century, for countries in mid-latitudes, like the US, for example. And that change is going to be even more dramatic if we look at the poorest 40% of countries, reducing per capita earnings there by about 70% by the close of the century. And this study focuses on the effects of climate change via temperature only, and it doesn't look at, it doesn't include impacts via other consequences of climate change like hurricanes or sea level rise. Another study, and this one comes from CDP, and we've previous talks talked about CDP. CDP runs the Global Disclosure System for Environmental Data, where companies can disclose their climate change questionnaire, water security questionnaire, and deforestation. So this study conducted by CDP in 2019 found that the world's biggest companies, 215 companies, to be more precise, have valued their climate risks to their businesses at almost $1 million, with many risks likely to happen according to their estimations within the next years. Another study, and I'm going to close with that one, this one comes from IMF. It's a 2020 study. And it found that the total costs of the 2018 wildfires in California were up to $35 billion, or 1.7% of the US GDP. In the same notes, over the past, IMF states that over the past decade, direct damages of such climate change-related disasters are estimated to add up to around 1.3 trillion. Of course, it's important to make a note here and say that these results provide us with a first evidence that economic activity in all regions is connected with with global climate. However, we are talking about projections about the future, and therefore these projections hold some uncertainty because we don't know exactly how we cannot predict future human actions. So climate change is a systemic risk, just because we cannot predict the future. So due to the complex nature of climate change, the exact outcomes, the exact timing, and the future pathways are uncertain. However, what we do know with a high degree of certainty and confidence is that physical and transition risks will materialize in the future. And those risks will affect whole economies, as we saw in the previous slides, including households, businesses, governments across all industries, jurisdictions, and geographies. However, the magnitude and nature of these risks will be determined by actions that we take today. So this diagram, it comes from the CRO Forum, and it demonstrates the range of impacts from climate change across multiple projections, multiple degrees of warming. So let's pick one. We can look at, for example, under physical impacts. This is warming by the end of the century, and we can look at frequency of extreme rainfall. So you can see the range of that single impact. You can see how it ranges across different scenarios. Next, we will look at how climate risks create financial risk by examining physical and transition risks in more detail. But before we do that, I would like to remind you of this, that higher transition risks are primarily associated with smaller temperature increases, such as a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase or a 2 degrees Celsius increase, which is the Paris goal, the Paris Agreement. And this happens because economies transition to emit less greenhouse gases. On the flip side of that, the higher the global temperatures, the higher the physical risks. In this diagram, we can see the CO2 emission trajectory, the CO2 emission pathways under different temperature rise scenarios. And that's based on the country's pledges and their current policies. So if you look at in the middle of this graph, where it says current policies. This is the warming projection by the end of the century, which is based on current policies that are in place right now by countries all over the world. So based on the currently implemented projections around the world, the result for the temperature rise is about 2.7 degrees Celsius, which is above the Paris Agreement. So we have to do something to change that. And this slide, we put the slide here because we want to give you a general overview of the process of how risk is viewed, of how climate-related risk is viewed as it relates to climate change. So we're going to start with these fundamentals. Climate change is a condition. Example, increase in temperature rise. Climate change results in climate phenomena like increased frequency and severity of storms or rising sea level. These phenomena, these climate phenomena themselves can be considered as risks or primary risks. And sometimes in literature, they are referred to as risks, primary risks, or climate drivers. These phenomena or primary drivers result in impacts. And this is what is going to be the main focus of our discussion today, because these can present themselves as risks and opportunities for organizations. Another name for that is secondary risks. Sometimes secondary risks can be referred to as primary risks, but it's important to note that these are secondary risks, they're not primary risks, and phenomena and impacts, primary and secondary risks, oftentimes commingle, but they need to be thought of separately. Okay, so let's dive into and talk more about climate-related risks and opportunities. What they are, how do we define them, and we can look at some examples of them in the next slides. So climate-related risks refer to the negative impacts of climate change. And climate-related opportunities, on the flip side, refer to the potential positive impacts from climate change. When we talk about risks, they are broken down into two big categories, into transition risks and physical risks. So transition risks are the changes in policy, technology, markets, in an effort to transition to a low-carbon, greener economy. And companies who don't adequately respond to these changes are also exposed to reputational risks as consumer expectations change. Now, the physical impacts of climate change can impact businesses directly or indirectly and cause disruptions to their operations or to their supply chain. And we break down physical risks again into two big buckets. One is acute risks and the other is chronic risks. And we will look at some examples later on in the next slides. So opportunities, climate-related opportunities. So in an effort to mitigate and respond to climate change, companies can also recognize opportunities, and they can manifest themselves as savings in resource efficiency or using lower emission sources of energy or the development of low products or services, just to name a few. So, as the slide says, climate-related risks and opportunities lead to financial impacts. And these financial impacts will affect businesses depending on their sector, depending on the geography where the operations are located, depending on the business model, but also depending on the specific climate-related risks and opportunities to which the company is exposed. And also its strategic planning and risk management decision-making, risk management processes to either mitigate, respond, control, or accept the risk, and, of course, realize the opportunity. So when a company identifies what their risks and opportunities are and evaluates its exposure to their climate-related risks and opportunities over a range of time horizons, that allows for a strategy for a transition to a net zero carbon economy, which of course is recognized by the Paris Agreement and by the United States Sustainable Development Goals. So let's look at some examples of physical risks and then transition risks.
So physical risks can be defined as either acute or chronic. So acute physical risks relate to specific weather events, such as and acute physical risk is event-driven. So we're talking about more heat waves or wildfires or worse flooding or more severe storms. Chronic physical risk relates to longer-term shifts in climate patterns.
So we're talking about changes in rainfall, changes in sea level rise. So things that are not event-driven. We see them happening over long periods of time. Now, let's see, these acute and chronic risks can create financial losses. And that can happen in two ways, as direct effects or indirect secondary effects. Direct losses refer to the physical or structural impacts caused by the disaster, such as the destruction of an infrastructure or of a facility caused by the force of these events. Indirect effects are the subsequent or secondary effects stemming from the initial destruction, such as a supply chain disruption from a weather event that affects a supplier that is then going to affect the business, the company. Let's look at some examples of transition risks. So, transition risks, as we said in the previous slide, relate to transitioning to a low-carbon economy. So those are the risks when our economies transition to a low-carbon economy. And they may entail extensive policy, technology, market changes to address this mitigation and adaptation efforts. So depending on the nature, the speed, the focus of these changes, transition risks may pose varying levels of financial and reputational costs for the companies. So let's look at one example, and we can look in the first column. So under policy and legal risk, policy risk relates to existing regulation aimed at addressing climate change through both mitigation policies that reduce climate change and adaptation policies. So one of the most frequently reported risks in CDP's climate change questionnaire is the increased pricing of greenhouse gas emissions. And given the growth of the carbon pricing mechanisms and regulations on a global scale, this is not surprising. And it is, of course, a risk with high financial implications for companies operating in high-emitting sectors. Okay, let's transition and give some examples of climate-related opportunities. So, climate-related opportunities can manifest themselves as savings in resource efficiency and using low-emission sources of energy. And we can think of, there's a growing evidence and good examples of companies that they were able to reduce their operating costs across their production and distribution processes, in particular in relation to reducing their energy footprint, but also including materials, including water, waste management. So that can be a resource efficiency opportunity that the company can realize. Energy source, so use of low emission sources of energy. And when we talk about low emission sources of energy, there are many examples such as wind, solar, etc. And according to IEA, the International Energy Agency, in order to meet global emission reduction goals, countries will need to transition a big percentage of their energy generation to low emission alternatives. We can look at products, at the development of low emission goods and services. That's another good example. Organizations that innovate and develop new low emission products or low emission services may improve their competitive position and capitalize on shifting consumer preferences. So those are some examples of climate-related opportunities that companies can look at. Okay, we're shifting gears a little bit. We will be talking about how companies can report on their climate-related risks and opportunities. So organizations can disclose their ESG performance, including their climate-related risks and opportunities, using various ESG reporting frameworks and standards like the ones that you see in the screen. All these are voluntary and each have slightly different approaches and audiences towards the disclosure of sustainability-related information. I think we have talked about CDP and TCFD in the previous talks, so I'll just briefly talk about GRI and SASB. So GRI standards are suitable for all organizations to report on their ESG impacts of their activities. So we're talking about an outward-facing approach to sustainability. GRI is good for every company in every sector. SASB, on the other hand, SASB are industry-specific standards that identify sustainability information that is financially important, financially material to the business. So it's more of an inward-facing approach. And then we've talked about CDP, the online platform that companies can report their environmental performance on. And we will be talking about TCFD in the next few slides. And the reason why we will be talking about TCFD, we want to focus this subsection of the talk to TCFD and CDP in particular, because they both have moved the climate disclosure agenda forward by emphasizing the connection, the link between climate-related risks and opportunities and financial stability. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD in short, is an industry-led body. It was established in 2015 by the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, and they set an important framework for companies to think more comprehensively about their approach and reporting on their climate-related risks and opportunities. So in 2017, the TCFD released their final report, which included recommendations for disclosures on climate-related information. These recommendations are voluntary, and they were designed to be applicable for all organizations across all sectors and jurisdictions, and focused on the financial impacts of climate-related issues. So the final recommendations are structured around four core organization elements or thematic areas, which is, it's very similar to how organizations operate: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And within those four core elements, we can find the 11 recommended disclosures, additional guidance for the financial sector and the non-financial sector as well, specifically companies that are more exposed to climate change. So note this diagram. This is an onion diagram. So note how the core elements are represented in this diagram. TCFD cautions that the recommendations should not be considered in silos. Rather, they are interconnected, with one another, and though they should be seen together as part of a holistic picture. And if we look at the strategy recommendation, we can see that it is supported by 3 recommended disclosures, which they're highlighted in the slide. So under the strategy recommendations, organizations are encouraged to report on their climate-related risks and opportunities and the impacts, the financial impacts of those identified risks and opportunities on their business. If you look at the 3rd recommendation, it says, describe the resilience of the company strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree Celsius scenario or lower. And this is the reason why we included climate scenario analysis in the title of the presentation, because it's gaining so much prominence these days. So, identifying your risks is step 1. Then you have to identify the impact, the economic, the financial impact of those risks and opportunities on the business strategy and financial planning. And the best way to do that, of course, is by doing a climate scenario analysis. Just because of the complex nature of climate change, we cannot stick to the traditional planning, the traditional business planning for decision-making. We have to resort to climate scenario analysis. So the other framework, CDP, CDP's climate change questionnaire has been aligned with TCFD since 2018 and asks companies to disclose data on how their climate-related issues are addressed in their governance, their strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And so for my case study, I am projecting here PepsiCo's 2022 CDP climate change disclosure. And the reason I did that is because I want you to see at the level of detail that companies are required to disclose information about their climate-related risks and opportunities. So in particular, this question is question 2.3a, and it's asking companies to provide details of the risks identified with the potential to have substantive financial or strategic impacts for their business. And you can see the level of detail that the question is asking companies to identify the risk type or the financial impact of the risk, the magnitude of the impact, how much it costs to respond to the impact, etc. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to quickly jump into the process. How do companies can get started on identifying and prioritizing their risks and opportunities? And this is what we call scoping. So every company, of course, is different. The process to identify risks and opportunities for the company is going to be different. For some companies, they have to start from scratch. They have to really think what their risks and opportunities are in the context of climate change. And sometimes the best way to do that is by performing a materiality assessment that really looks on the risks and opportunities by climate change. Other companies, they don't have to start from square one. They identify, they realize what their physical or some transition risks related to climate change might be. They just need a better system to categorize them, or they need to prioritize them. So in that case, they follow a different process. They don't have to start from a materiality assessment. Other companies, they know exactly, they have a risk map, they have analyzed their risks and opportunities, they know what they are, and they might just need to integrate their already identified risks and opportunities into their management system. So really, it really depends on where the company is. We start this process by scoping, by understanding where the company is, and we're trying to meet every company where they are in their journey to understand their climate-related risks and opportunities. And here on the slides, we have some questions, some scoping questions that we like to start this conversation with, for example, a good question to ask is, what is your organization's current risk assessment and management process? Or does your organization have a process for identifying, assessing, and responding to risks and opportunities? Or have you identified any inherent climate-related risks with the potential to have an economic impact on your business? Or what criteria do you use to identify climate-related risks? Do you use time scale? Do you use, likelihood, magnitude, financial implications, etc.? Okay, so I'm going to go through this slide very quickly. These are just some recommendations. When disclosing information about climate-related risks, companies, as per TCFD guidance and TCFD recommendations, they should include a detailed description of the risk. We saw the slide from PepsiCo's CDP disclosure, that detailed. So you have to talk about the risk type, the risk driver, potential financial impact, analyze the financial impact, likelihood of the risk occurring, magnitude of the risk, cost of response to risk, explanation of the potential financial impact figure. So you have to really provide a very comprehensive analysis around the risk you're identifying. There are some other special considerations that come with the identification of climate-related risks that we have to take into account. So where the risk may materialize is really important, so location matters. For example, the effects of climate change are going to be, even if we're talking about the same thing, the same effect, they're going to differ based on location, so that's one factor that we need to think. The time horizons are really important because organizations need to consider the long-term impacts of climate change, and that's something that we don't see that very often in traditional business planning methods. An explanation of the relevance of the risk to the company and its operations, an explanation of where climate-related risks exacerbate other business or environmental risks, and this is very important because we saw in the fundamental slide, we said climate change is a risk, but it's also a risk multiplier, meaning that it can exacerbate risks that the company is already facing. And we have scenario analysis as climate scenario analysis as the last bullet point with an asterisk, because we have talked about how climate change is a systemic phenomenon. We don't know the exact outcomes. We don't know when the impacts are going to materialize and how companies are going to be impacted. And we've talked about the traditional business planning methods that do not take into account the complex interrelationships of climate change. And so scenario analysis, in that context, climate scenario analysis can be a very useful tool for organizations for their strategic and risk management decision-making, because it allows for a better understanding of the climate-related risks, the dynamics of climate-related impacts, and how and why and where different outcomes, different pathways may come about. So this is just a slide that talks about forward-looking information. So in reporting of corporate strategies in climate change, companies really need to engage with forward-looking information that will likely reach beyond the timeframes commonly used in decision-making. So we're talking about long-term, which can mean 10 to 15 years from now. So forward-looking information is going to be commonly used when we're talking about risks and opportunities. And this is an example. This is a risks and opportunities table from a company that has done the exercise of identifying their risks and opportunities. So this is what it looks like. And that's a good example. It comes from Mercury. Mercury is an electricity company from New Zealand. So in this table, what they do is they present their top 5 risks and opportunities. And they also present the likelihood, the impacts on the business, the time periods in which they think the risks are going to materialize. They also talk about their assessment methodologies, and they do that in that table. So that's a really neat way to present your risks and opportunities in a table. Looking ahead, this is my closing slide. So if climate-related risks and opportunities were an abstract concept for you before this talk, hopefully after this presentation, they are being viewed as something tangible, something that companies are facing or will face in the future. So the unique nature of climate change may require specialized attention, like climate scenario analysis, but ultimately it should be seen as a financial risk and therefore should be treated like any other risk. Therefore, organizations should consider how they will include climate change into their existing risk management frameworks and processes. And the usual steps in this risk management framework should be applied to climate risk management, but they may need to be adapted to capture climate change's global and systemic nature. And that's all that I have for you. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.